So next, I'd like to turn the conversation over to Carlisle Begay, and he is going to be having a conversation about some of the tribal and indigenous aspects of this facility and uranium mining. There is, for those that don't know, there is a legacy of uranium mining that started in the 1940s, went to the 50s, into the 60s, and there was it was a time when we had the Cold War, when we needed uranium for to counter the Soviet Union. However, there was it was a government-sponsored weapons program essentially, and there was a lot of uranium mining and uranium processing that occurred, especially on tribal lands, which would never meet today's standards, and they're still having to deal with those issues today. And so, Energy Fuels is attempting to help in helping to clean up some of these messes that are left over from many decades ago. And we also were able to enter into an agreement with the Navajo Nation on the transport of ore, which was something that I mean, honestly, it's one of the prouder moments of my career was being involved in that. And so I'd like to turn it over to Carlisle to have a discussion about these issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Curtis, and hope people in the back can hear us just fine. And it truly is an honor to be here this afternoon. Thank you to Mark and your team at Energy Fuels for inviting me and our distinguished Navajo leadership and thought leaders on the Navajo Nation to your mill site here. Before we get into the logistics of the panel and the history that Curtis was referencing, it's also a recognition that the panel's discussion here is really at an intersection of a trust relationship that Energy Fuels built with the Navajo Nation. Today's panel is titled Building a Responsible Energy Future, the intersection between tribes, state and federal governments, and industry is important. Unfortunately, energy and mining in particular within indigenous communities or even within the Navajo Nation is replete with a lot of tragic actions, a lot of missed opportunities, and a lot of things that unfortunately we cannot change. And a lot of our communities, particularly in the Navajo Nation, still live with that legacy. And I appreciate the leadership of Energy Fuels of recognizing that that relationship between an energy company and a tribal nation builds on the foundation of trust and listening. Today's panel will discuss some components of a historic milestone that was struck earlier this year between the Navajo Nation and Energy Fuels to allow Energy Fuels to truck ore from the Pinyon Plain mine just south of the Grand Canyon to their mill site here. In the negotiations that we endured over about 8 months was just simply a lot of listening. I was born on the Navajo Nation. I was actually born at the footsteps of the Black Mesa coal mine. And the majority of my family worked for Peabody Energy Coal Company. And my grandfather, as a young kid, drove me to and from mine sites across the Navajo Nation. And it was there that I began to understand the relationship between industry and our tribal communities. My aspiration as a result of that experience was to go to medical school. My undergraduate degree is in molecular and cellular biology. And my whole aspiration was to go to medical school to come back to help our people in the Navajo Nation. But a lot of that changed because I got involved in politics. I realized that in policy, that's where, in my view, a lot of difference can be made. And that's the purpose of our panel today, is to understand the intersection between policy and energy and the importance of that, particularly in terms of the relationship between industry and tribal communities. But on the heels of a historic milestone of the ore transport agreement between the Navajo Nation and Energy Fuels, the conversation began to evolve into how can the company assist the Navajo Nation in the legacy of abandoned uranium mines across the Navajo Nation. Our communities and our people still live and endure that legacy today. There are over 500 abandoned uranium mines throughout the Navajo Nation. And it's a legacy that we're still trying to address. And we're on the cusp at the moment of forging a new public-private partnership that allows us as a Navajo Nation to address decades-long issues related to cleanup and doing it responsibly in partnership with not only Energy Fuels, but there are other private companies that are assisting and want to assist the Navajo Nation in this effort. So before I get more into some of the details, I'm going to pause and recognize that one of our panelists is still on his way. Stephen Netcity, the director of the Navajo Nation EPA, should be here any moment, but hopefully he joins us soon. But I'm going to take a moment to allow our panelists to introduce themselves.
Yate Bene, good morning to my relatives. She'eya, I'm Brenda Jesus. And my Navajo clans in English is I'm of the Blackstreet Wood people clan and born into the Bitterwater clan, which is Tsitnajinin Shlon Twitachini Bashishchin, my maternal and paternal clan. I currently serve on the 25th Navajo Nation Council and I chair the Resources and Development Committee. Now, the communities that I represent are St. Michael's, which is adjacent to Windsor Rock, and then also Oak Springs and Pine Springs chapter. And Resources and Development Committee of the 25th Navajo Nation Council currently oversees multiple divisions. I believe we're the busiest committee of the 25th Navajo Nation Council, overseeing Division of Natural Resources. We have Navajo Department of Transportation. We have Navajo Nation Environmental Protection Agency. We oversee the Division of Community Development and Division of Economic Development. So just as Carlisle had mentioned, this is my first run of being in the political arena. Before that, I was pretty much have the project management background as I have my MBA in that field. And again, this is something new, but I've been passionate to be able to be the echo for a lot of my constituents across Navajo Nation. So again, I welcome the invitation and thank you for everyone being here today and really getting a snapshot and understanding from the tribal Indian community perspective, especially Navajo, in regards to transitioning into the renewable energy aspect. Thank you.
My name is Leonard Sosi. I'm the director of Eastern Navajo Land Commission. Before that, way before that, when I was born, I had arrived with the clans Tochane. Aronanishtaje Bashashin, Ashide, Ashiro, Nakaidanation, Ashid Ada, Ashibeda, Kedo, Koko. And I see some native brothers and sisters here. There are one thing that's interesting is before I became the director and was called upon to help out the Eastern Navajo Land Commission, I was a former state senator for New Mexico and then the council delegate. And so, but way before that, I was doing research in molecular biology and doing recombinant DNA work. And so, and I got to meet a Fred Begay, a Navajo physicist out at Los Alamos. And we used to talk about other things. But what is interesting, though, is the things that I've been taught, and I'll talk more about it, is that just because it's there, you don't just take. Just because Mars is there doesn't mean you just take it. And that's some of the legacy we have in the United States history. And many of the problems that we have and that we're dealing with, the abandoned uranium mines. And so I think it is important to show respect even to Mother Earth. And that's why in our way of life, when we talk about it, we say meaning that you tell Mother Earth you respect her and that you're going to talk about what she has to give and what she offers, and that if you're going to take something, you ask for permission to do so. And so that's some of the things that are in our teaching that you don't find being taught in schools. and it shouldn't just be take. So, but now we have 101 abandoned uranium mine in the Eastern Navajo Agency. And Navajo Nation is divided up into 5 agencies. And my charge is to look after lands in Eastern Navajo Agency. And that's how we ended up with the discussion about abandoning uranium mine. So we'll be talking more about that. Yeah. I don't know, Carlisle, I see Dan here, Moken. I don't know if you want him to stand in while Steve arrives.
Yeah, please. He got delayed in traffic around ANF and that, but he's on his way. But we work closely together. My name is Dan Moquin. I'm with the Navajo Nation Department of Justice. I've worked for the Navajo Nation in a variety of roles for about 22 years. So I know a little bit about Navajo Nation, but obviously I'd rather have a panel of all Navajos. But Steve will be here quickly. But we're all working together. We really want a goal of clean closures for the Navajo Nation. We want the waste off the Navajo Nation and restored to the conditions that it was before. And Energy Fuels has been a partner since we worked with them on Pinyon Plain. They've connected us with people and helped us out and given us information and willing to be a part of the one of the key components of what we're trying to do, because we have a remediation technique which concentrates uranium in a smaller fraction, but that needs to go somewhere. And we think that since COP28 and COP29 and COP30 said we're going to triple nuclear power, it makes sense to be recycling a lot of that uranium. And with the help of Energy Fuels, we hope to achieve that. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. I failed to properly introduce myself. My name is Carlisle Begay, and I know there's some relatives here as well. She e toskonishla ki ani e bashishchin. I was born and raised about an hour and a half or so from here in Black Mesa. And I am very proud of the fact that I was raised by a grandmother who never went to school, never learned how to read or write, but one of the wisest women I've ever had. Has a big influence in my life, and someone that I still cherish in terms of her wisdom and her leadership. But with that said, one of the things as a kid, especially growing up with the Navajo Nation, there's not many opportunities, particularly for employment. And one of the things that the Navajo Nation and a lot of other tribes, not only in the Southwest, but really around the country and around the world with indigenous communities that are at the same intersection with protecting their homeland, protecting their community, protecting their environment, protecting their people, but working in partnership with energy companies or mining companies. That history, as I mentioned, is not easy. But we also recognize that a lot of our tribal communities, like the Navajo Nation, we're not isolated anymore. Our communities and our people have to find a way to compete in a very global economy. And that's exactly what Energy Fuels is doing with the mineral and resources that they are bringing into the mill site here. These are resources that are used for so many different applications, from space to our phones, to cars, to medical research, to medical cures. The spectrum of how these resources benefit us as a society is incredible. But with that, as a Navajo Nation, we recognize, as Senator Sosi mentioned, the ability to do it in partnership and in conjunction in a framework of trust. And as I'm mentioning in terms of how do tribal communities do we compete in a global economy? How do we provide those opportunities? Because there are a lot of our own people who work here at the mill site. There are a lot of our own people that work at the mine site. How do we cross-section these opportunities, but do so in a responsible manner? And I want to give it to our panelists to maybe offer some thoughts about the critical junction we're at right now in terms of the nation and the future of energy, and what does that mean for you and your perspective to the Navajo Nation?
Thank you, Carlisle, for that question. So, chairing the Resources and Development Committee and having to have lived within the fossil fuel industry on Navajo Nation, meaning I lived in close proximity to what was known as the Pittsburgh Chevron Mining Company there in Sabonito, New Mexico, just not too far from Window Rock, Arizona. I believe that was the first mine that was closed there on Navajo Nation and further onto the Peabody coal mining. So one of the areas that's Navajo Nation, being in this leadership capacity, I have to play the role of having to be that listener to a lot of our constituents. You know, we talk about the injustices that had happened from prior decades, and how do we hurdle over the injustices? And by way of that, providing, I think, adequate, educational informations or seminars to a lot of our constituents. Because we often say that we want to be able to be competitive. And how do we gain that competitive advantage as Navajo Nation? And it's that we're not left behind. And prime example, Energy Fields came to Navajo Nation, and I know that there is still a lot of resistance. You know, being in this leadership role, I've come to understand that we do have NGOs that are educating our Navajo constituents across Navajo. Just the word of Dota, meaning no. But at the same time, we're trying to diversify our portfolio as leadership, to be able to be sustainable and self-sufficient going forward for decades to come, to be able to leave not just the financial resource, but other resources for 7 generations down the road. So there's 24 delegates on the 25th Navajo Nation Council, and we have 110 chapter houses, which I say are municipalities across Navajo. Now, every community across Navajo have their different outlook and perspective when we talk about whether it's the fossil fuel or the renewable energy, uranium being one of them, and nuclear. And I, being that one delegate, honestly believe that this is the time opportunity is granted. And I think, my colleague here, Mr. Sosi, saying that we still have to think about the traditional perspective and values, meaning that we give our offerings when we're going to be taken from Mother Earth, because at the end of the day, it's prosperity not just to the Navajo Nation through the revenue stream that comes back to Navajo Nation, but it's also prosperity to the company that is extracting and taking this off and utilizing it to whether we're heating up homes or lighting up homes or businesses across, this great country. So again, that's where, as a leadership, I have to be very careful. I am in support, and I'm going to say this on the record before everyone today. I am in support of nuclear energy. But how do I explain that back to my people back at home? Because they do not understand, the periodic table, just as Carlisle mentioned. Some of them don't have that education to understand. But how do we get that education across and bridge that gap to where we could at least get the community buy-in? So every day as leadership, being in my capacity, it's always trying to understand how do we respectfully, bring this message across to our people on Navajo Nation. Because a lot of our constituents or population that is on Navajo right now is possibly baby boomers or even further back. And I know that for younger generation, myself, and to the newer generation, we're looking at wanting to diversify, and they're living off the reservation. But I'm so fortunate to have come back to try to give back to my people. But I'm contemplating on how do I properly bridge, that proper education. Again, there are these areas that I as a leader am challenged with, but it's also trying to hurdle over to educate 23 of my colleagues on council to be in support of renewable energy projects. Again, it's been a challenge since I've been on council. We actually have 15 months left for this particular term as 25th Navajo Nation Council. And I still have yet to want to leave a legacy, some sort of a mark to say this is what the Resources and Development Committee has done to bridge partnership, like right here, Energy Fields, and we also have other tribes in Indian country that are in close proximity. We got the Southern Ute tribe in western Colorado that is doing great stuff. And I know that they wanted to bridge a partnership with Navajo Nation. So again, it is very, we're in a unique state right now. And I really think that the Navajo Nation really needs to take up on this opportunity because, opportunities often don't come back around. And again, I just wanted to state that as one leader of the 25th Navajo Nation Council, Carlisle. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay. We're going to have to speak up a little more so people in the back can hear. One of the questions I have for Senator Sosi, as a former New Mexico state senator, a former council delegate on the Navajo Nation Council himself, and now the director of the Eastern Navajo Land Commission, you have a very unique insight in understanding state, federal, and tribal politics and government. In your experience, and as you look at Energy Fuels and its partnerships and the cleanup effort that we're working on as well, what would you recommend to the audience here in terms of understanding Navajo, understanding tribes, and how to work with tribes like the Navajo Nation?
Thank you, Carlisle. One of the things that I think we have to look at is the history. Why are Navajo people resentful of people digging up uranium or beginning to work with uranium? And that element of trust lingers and begins to go away and not develop. We took a trip to Washington, D.C. to talk with Secretary Bergen. It was interesting. It's like him saying, "Whush that, whush that, whush that. Yat come in, come in." And then he showed us his taxidermy elk sitting in his office. He told his staff that these are our Navajo leaders. They've come a long way to see me. Give them some water. Not many CEOs do that. Not many astronauts do that. Not many political people do that. But Secretary Bergen did that. And as we were sitting there and talking with him, we were not on guard. We had a good conversation with him. And it was quite interesting. And then with the Benton uranium mine, we're trying to figure out a way to address it. And the commission that I work with passed a resolution saying that, well, take it off the reservation. Take it off Navajo Nation. It is in your ICA to say that you're going to take them to deer trails. And they found an excuse to say it's cost prohibitive, it's going to cost us a lot. We really can't do that. And so we asked them, so well, why do you have it in your ICA analysis? Stop giving us false choices. Stop giving the public false choices. And we were not getting along with the U.S. Department of Energy people out here. And that the trust is not there. And it's because they don't listen to us of what we're trying to propose. So then one day we met the CEO from Energy Fuels. And through, I think he's still on his way, you'll see him, our expert in uranium remediation, Mr. Stephen Begay, Dan, and others. Steve. And he entered into an agreement and talked with Mark and others and developed this agreement. And so in return, we're trying to explain back to our people of why the uranium is transported through Navajo land and then on up here. But over in our Eastern Agency, we're talking about piles of uranium mining waste. And what do we do with that? And part of the calculus in resolving this problem is Energy Fuels with ablation. And then, these are Mr. Ed City working with the RDC, Resources Development Committee, working with Energy Fuels, and working with other scientists, have begun to put together a formula for resolving the issue. And through ablation, and then dividing the piles, and then sending some up this way. And Energy Fuels willing to accept that. And so part of the recycling. But what is interesting, though, is that we seem unable to convince the U.S. Department of Energy that this is the better route. And there's this trust relationship between Indian tribes and the federal government. And the U.S. Department of Energy is part of the federal government. And they're supposed to listen to their beneficiary as a trustee. But lately, we haven't had really good conversations with them. And so the better conversations has developed with Energy Fuels and others. And I think that lends itself to resolving a problem. In this case, trying to resolve the problem of what to do with the abandoned mining waste. And so I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sosi. So the picture that we're trying to paint for you a little bit here is in terms of the initiation, the concept of transporting ore from Pinyon Plain to the mill site here was met initially with a lot of opposition. It took a lot of meeting, listening, and trust building, and there's still a lot of that that's got to occur. But what it's transformed into is a relationship that now a company like Energy Fuels and others are working with the Navajo Nation to address a multi-decade legacy issue, but more importantly, being able to sit at the same table between a tribal community and industry and an engagement of those discussions that we're having with the federal government, with the state government, doing that in conjunction together. The power or the ability to influence decision makers in DC or the state capitals is quite incredible in terms of the alignment between one of the largest tribes in the U.S. and Energy Fuels, as an example, to go into these meetings, as Senator Sosi is mentioning, with the Secretary of Interior and others, and the power to be able to align interest and speak with one voice. One question that I have for Mr. Moquin is, Dan's been with the Navajo Nation a very long time, and I respect that the fact that he's become quite an expert in Navajo. But his job is interesting in that he is protecting his client, which is the Navajo Nation. And in these negotiations with the ore transport agreement, and as we're moving forward to evolving that to remediation cleanup, Dan, what are some thoughts about your role as a lawyer and working with the Navajo Department of Justice, your perspective on industry and the importance of the collaborative relationships with a tribe and industry together?
Well, I would say in terms of the public-private partnership, that is the key, and we found we've gotten a lot further with that. I mean, my role as an attorney obviously is first to know Navajo Nation law, and that was the important part. That was the important part of our initial negotiations and what we could do and the limitations that we were under, because part of what the environmental group said is, well, you can't bring under our RMTA, which is the Radioactive Materials Transportation Act, you can't bring materials end the story across the Navajo Nation. And I had to remind them that if you really look at the statute had cutouts, it had exclusions, and that was where you were dealing with public roads. So what we negotiated with Energy Fuels, respecting our law, but also we made them understand what our law was, what limitations we were under. Obviously, we always were aware that they are a company and they have shareholders. They have to answer to people too. And we needed to we needed to compromise, but we couldn't compromise our law, and we did not. And so we came up with an agreement, and we actually had to make statutory changes that actually allowed us to enter into an agreement. So for Energy Fuels, until we had more our own rules under the RMTA, we entered into a contract. It was it was a 1 year change where it basically said we could enter a contractual relationship, and that's actually what we created with Energy Fuels. Now, they were very respectful of Navajo Nation traditions. They were very respectful of the people that we're negotiating with. I mean, I don't think there wasn't any raised voices in the room. We negotiated as adults, which, maybe we should said that to Congress, to see, show them some film on how people can, how to negotiate, because we were able to do that. But the legacy issues are quite critical. And, we have a Dene Natural Resources Protection Act, and it says until there's proper remediation on the Navajo Nation, that's another statute that we have, that we won't even entertain new mining on the Navajo Nation. So, in some ways, if Energy Fuels is helping us to do this, but they're helping the country have potentially another source. Council will have to decide that. Navajo Nation people will have to decide that. But until the remediation occurs to our satisfaction of the legacy waste, that can occur. And it's quite important because I was looking at the EIA, and I don't know the split between Arizona and New Mexico, but I know that 40% of all the remaining uranium in the Navajo Nation is in the state of New Mexico. Most of it will have to be accessed through ISL or ISR operations, but it's there. It's a huge resource. It's a huge resource that will not be available to the Navajo Nation under our own law until there actually is satisfactory remediation. And so that's what we're trying to achieve. And with our private partners, we're getting very close to basically having a way to do the type of remediation that the Navajo Nation people deserve. And there were a lot of mistakes made, and I'm not going to go into the history, but where the industry, the previous industry, we're not talking about the present industry, could have told people simple things like, don't use the waste rock as building materials for your shelters. Simple things like that would have prevented a lot of this apprehension that people have, on the Navajo Nation, and a lot of people have relatives that worked in underground mines and died, and there's a lot of tragedies. So, that legacy you have to chip away at, and as it was said earlier, establish that trust. And that's the corporations we're working with now. We have a good relationship, and we're building that trust, and that allows us to move forward. And we've met, through connections. We also went up to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and we met with Administrator Lee Zeldin. And so we've actually been able to talk to a person, and he was very receptive. And what we're trying to do has, we think, bipartisan support. We also helped a company called DISA, who has the ablation technology. We helped them get their license and appear before the NRC. We were in a meeting, and you had two senators, very very politically different. Senator Lummis, and then you had Senator Kelly, Mark Kelly, another astronaut, and they both were for this technology that we're trying to utilize on the Navajo Nation and fully exploit. And so you have very conservative, and I have great respect for both of them, but they're both very good people, obviously ideologically on different places, but they both are practical, reasonable people that can see a good technology and say we need to utilize that. And so that's where we are. So
Thank you very much, Dan. As we begin to wrap up here, I'll open up to the audience to see if there are any questions for our panel of tribal leaders up here. Any questions?
So, have you reached out to other communities like Moab and Grand Junction and even up in Salt Lake where cleanups have had to go on and are still going on to the day to work with connections and et cetera?
Thank you for that question. So, with this Resources and Development Committee, in conjunction with Director Stephen City, who's supposed to have been here, we've actually reached out to the city of Silverton in Silverton, Colorado, and we met with the city council and other representatives there, I believe a year ago, last year in May, just to share some insight and some of the challenges that they encountered, and then also just some information sharing on what the Navajo Nation can do, like for possible best practices. So that's the only one that I'm aware of as leadership. I'm not too sure if my colleague, Mr. Sosi, does.
We've been in touch with other responsible parties like BHP and others, and we've met with them and had good conversations with them. And so I think they are coming around to being partners with Navajo Nation in resolving this issue. So in that sense, we've also reached out to them in building this public-private partnership.
yes, I mean, one thing about Director Ed City, he is actually on his third various administrations. He's worked at NAPA and been the head of an NAPA, but he also worked for US EPA, both in the Washington office and in Region 9 in San Francisco. He has a lot of connections, and we've been reaching out in our area. We're starting to do the outreach to the Pueblos, where Acoma and Laguna Pueblos, and where we're talking to, obviously, we're talking to the state and people that are known in the state. We've actually reached out to USGS. We've had meetings with them on both this technology, which also has the ability to produce rare earths. So we're doing a lot of networking, and Director at City is very familiar with the Moab situation. I forgot where he was, whether it was at Region 9 when that was going on. Obviously, they're in a different region, or he was at the Washington office. But yes, we've been reaching out. We've been reaching out to everybody that's been impacted and everybody that can potentially help us remediate our situation. And so I think that's one of the reasons he's been effective, with our outreach. We also have used like the NRC's tribal liaison. She's been wonderful. Yes, the outreach is being done, and Director Ed City is reaching out. But the Moab's situation, I mean, that's one sense that Navajo Nation is always envious of that because they had political pull and because of their location, they got a very expensive remedy, and I'm glad it was done. I mean, nobody wants any pollution going into the waters, very important waters, and in the Colorado River basin area. But what we're seeking at Lake Ambrosia Lake would be a much cheaper cleanup, but we'd be very satisfied because it's an area that was identified, and I'm going to end with this, at least my comment. It was identified long ago by US EPA and others that it was the ideal place to put the Navajo waste and ideal. There's a number of Department of Energy sites out there, Umpqua sites where mill waste is even put, and it's because it has very thick Mankell shale, multiple levels. It has a ton of depression to keep water out. It is an ideal place, but you deal with bureaucracies, and what they were looking for, they put in their computers as, okay, we want an Umpqua site under DOE care and maintenance, and then we want some BLM land that's near it. And oh well, there isn't sufficient capacity out of Ambrosia Lake, and then we came with the private party that we've identified that came to us and said, we're willing to donate at this to the Department of Energy, and you can use this site. And by the way, we went out there. It's a massive, massive area. You could take all the waste from the Navajo Nation in New Mexico, Laguna, and Pueblo and put it out there. But the bureaucracy wasn't ready for that. We're winning them over. But that's what we face. And that's what we find, that we're having a lot better situation dealing with our private partners, because they don't have that bureaucratic mindset, and they actually are looking at answers that make sense, and they're fiscally viable, and that's why we're having better luck actually working with the private parties than we actually are with the bureaucracy. Although that is starting to change, and we're thankful for that.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, and thank you very much for listening to our discussion here this afternoon. I hope that you take away the experience that we've had between the Navajo Nation and Energy Fuels over the last year, a relationship that was initially oppositional. The Navajo Nation told Energy Fuels, no way are you going to transport ore through our tribal communities. Sitting and listening and talking in multiple meetings, so I commend Curtis and Mark, Dave Freeland and Scott Backen and the whole Energy Fuels team for their resilience to endure multiple meetings, multiple discussions to get to an ore transport agreement that now has evolved even beyond that concept to clean up, to also now looking at opportunities to work in partnership, not only between just one company, but multiple companies. And it can be done. And more importantly, the message I hope you take away is, as tribal nations, we can be a great ally and a great partner. And it's just important to understand that starts with trust and listening and learning. And we're excited for what's ahead in terms of the cleanup, and we value the partnership that Energy Fuels brings. So, Curtis, thank you very much. Mark, for allowing us to be here this afternoon. Okay.